In 1953, a young wife stood at the counter of a brand new suburban house, drying the kitchen tools she had lined up like little soldiers. And nearly everyone she expected to outlive her. The skillet had been her mother's. The glass bowls would one day go to her daughter. And not a single one was built to be thrown away. That was the quiet rule her whole generation lived by, and one phrase explains almost everything that follows. Made to be, handed down. Somewhere in the last 70 years, we traded that idea for tools that break on schedule and beg to be replaced. And your grandmother would have found the swap baffling. She knew the difference in her hands, in the weight of a pan and the crank of a handle. So here are 20 forgotten kitchen gadgets from the 1950s that did the job better than anything in your kitchen tonight. Let us count down from 20. Number 20. The wire egg slicer. It was the most ordinary thing in the drawer. A hinged frame strung with thin wires that came down through a hard-boiled egg in one clean motion. By the 1950s, almost every kitchen had one, usually pressed aluminum, a shower gift that cost less than $1. A taut wire has no real thickness, so it parts the soft white and the crumbling yolk without dragging or smearing the way a knife does. And every slice comes out the same height. You laid the peeled egg in the cradle, brought the wires down slow, and lifted out a fan of perfect ovals for a salad. The plastic one you buy now usually cracks at the hinge inside a year. If the egg slicer saved your knuckles, the next tool saved a whole afternoon of stained fingers. Number 19. The cherry pitter. In a 1950s summer, when a backyard tree handed you 20 pounds of cherries at once, this gadget was the difference between a pie by supper and a pie by midnight. You dropped the cherry into a little cup with a hole in the bottom, squeezed the handle, and a blunt rod punched through the center, driving the stone. Out while the fruit kept its shape. The kitchen smelled like warm fruit, and the front of an apron turned pink. Today, you buy cherries already pitted at twice the price, with the best of the juice gone. If the pitter saved an afternoon, the next gadget refused to waste a single drop. Number 18. The glass citrus reamer. It was a heavy dish of pressed glass with a ridged cone in the middle and a moat around it. And your grandmother kept hers on the windowsill. You pressed half an orange onto the cone and twisted, and the ridges tore the membranes open, while the moat caught the juice and trapped the seeds against a ring of points. No motor to heat the juice, no plastic to hold the bitter oil from the peel. Half a dozen oranges, a few minutes of wrist work, and you had juice with the pulp still in it. The electric juicer that replaced it has a motor that burns out and a dozen parts to wash. The reamer lasted because it was solid glass. The next tool lasted because it was solid steel. Number 17. The nested measuring cups and spoons. A set of stamped metal cups and a spoon, the Foley Company of Minneapolis made some of the best, routinely served 3 generations, because there was nothing to wear out. A stamped steel quarter cup is a quarter cup forever. It does not flex like soft plastic. It does not fade until you cannot read the line. And it does not warp in a hot dishwasher and start lying about how much flour you just added. You scooped, leveled with the back of a knife, and the cake came out right because the measure was honest. The bright plastic set you own will be vague and cracked inside a few years, and you will never quite know why your baking drifted. Those first tools asked almost nothing of you. The next rewarded a cook who knew what she was doing. Number 16. The wire pastry blender. It was a handle holding a fan of stiff curved wires, and from the 1930s through the 50s, it lived in the drawer of anyone who made pie crust from scratch. Flaky pastry depends on small bits of cold fat staying solid inside the dough until they hit the oven, where they burst into steam and lift the layers apart. The wires cut chilled butter into the flour in seconds, leaving little pea-sized pieces, while your warm hands never touched it. You rocked the blender through the bowl a dozen times and stopped when the flour went pebbly. Today, the food processor does it in one whir, but the friction warms the butter and melts it into the flour, which is exactly why the crust comes out tough instead of flaky. If the pastry blender kept your heat away from the butter, the next put your control back into everything else. Number 15. The hand crank rotary egg beater. Two interlocking wheels, turned by a side handle, spun a pair of looped blades, and beaters stamped A and J or Dover sat in nearly every drawer before the electric mixer took over. Cranking by hand, your grandmother could feel the exact moment. Egg whites turned to stiff peaks, or cream thickened to the edge of butter, and she stopped on a dime, something a one-speed electric beater plowing ahead never could. A cup of cream, a steady crank, 2 minutes, and you had whipped cream with no can and no propellant. The handle turned with a soft tin whir many people still remember as the sound of their grandmother's kitchen. The cordless beater you own does the job faster and robs you of all that judgment, which is how cream turns to butter while you check your phone. That beater put muscle into the wet work. The next put AR into the dry. Number 14. The hand sifter. The Foley Company patented a sifter in 1943 that you could work with one hand, a squeeze of the grip turning a wire agitator that pushed flour through a fine screen. Flour settles and packs tight in the bag, so a scooped cup can hold far more than a recipe expects. And the screen breaks up the clumps and folds air back in, so the flour measures true and the cake comes out fine and even instead of dense. One-handed, your grandmother could sift over the bowl, while her other hand held the recipe card. Modern recipes just tell you to whisk the flour in the bag and hope, because almost nobody owns the tool that did it properly. Pause for a moment, because one thing connects every tool so far, and it is the key to the whole countdown. None of them had a motor. No cord, no battery, no circuit board. Not a single part a normal person could not see, understand, and replace at the kitchen table. They were tools, not appliances. The work came from the hand, which kept the cook in charge and feeling the food the entire time. And it meant there was almost nothing that could fail. Your great-grandmother did not buy a new beater every 2 years, because the old one did not break, and on the rare day it did, the hardware store sold the one gear it needed for a dime. That is the principle hiding inside nearly every tool we are counting down. Made to be handed down. Subscribe before we go any further, because the back half of the countdown is where these tools stop being quaint and start making the gadgets on your own counter look like a swindle. Now for the ones that did real work. The first of those workhorses turned a stubborn job into a 1-minute chore. Number 13. The hand crank nut grinder. A glass jar screwed onto a metal head with a little crank, and you turned walnuts or pecans into an even meal for a cake or a pie topping. The reason it beat anything electric is heat, or the lack of it. A blade grinder spins so fast that the friction warms the nuts and crushes their oil out, and your dry crumbs slump into a greasy paste. The slow crank shears each nut once and drops it through, cool and dry. A half cup of pecans, a minute of cranking, and you had a light grind that folded into batter without weighing it down. Try the same thing in your processor and you will find out 4 seconds too late that you have made nut butter. That was a workhorse. The next tool was pure joy, and it came out of the cupboard once a year. Number 12, the aluminum cookie press. A tube of dough with a plunger and a set of stamped discs, the Miro company made the ones most people remember, and it pushed soft butter dough through a shaped opening to make those little pressed Christmas cookies in trees and wreaths and stars. A cool aluminum barrel kept the dough firm enough to hold a crisp edge, and the screw plunger gave you fine control. 1 click of dough per cookie straight onto the pan. The whole house smelled of butter and almond, and the children fought over who got to crank. The plastic presses sold now flex under the pressure and blur the design, which is why store-bought Spritz cookies look like nothing in particular. If the cookie press worked by keeping the dough cold, the next tool made cold its entire purpose. Number 11, the hollow glass rolling pin. It looked like an ordinary pin, but it was a sealed glass cylinder with a stopper at one end, and you filled it with cold water or even ice before rolling out pastry. Warm hands and a warm kitchen melt the fat in pie dough and ruin the flake. So a cook fighting a hot afternoon rolled the chill straight into the dough as she worked. Cold water in, stopper home, and a crust that stayed crisp and short even in August. Nobody sells a cooled rolling pin today, so people just fight their warm kitchen and wonder why the crust turns greasy and tough. The chilled pin fought the weather, the next fought pure drudgery, and turned a chore into a small show. Number 10, the clamp on apple peeler. It bolted to the edge of the table and you jammed an apple onto a 3-pronged fork and turned a crank, and a spring-loaded blade peeled, cored, and spiral sliced the whole apple in about 5 seconds. The apple did all the moving. As the crank drove the fruit forward and spun it, a follower blade rode the curve and held a constant depth, so the peel came off in one continuous paper-thin ribbon, and the core ran straight down the center. A bushel of apples for sauce or pie went from an hour of knife work to a few minutes of cranking, and children stood in line to watch the long ribbon spool onto the floor. You can still buy these, nearly unchanged, but almost nobody does, reaching instead for a flimsy peeler and a paring knife. That peeler mastered the apple. The next mastered the morning. Number 9, the hand crank coffee mill. A little wooden box with a drawer or an iron mill clamped to the wall, it ground coffee and whole spices with a pair of toothed burrs turned by a crank. The difference between that and the grinder on your counter is the difference between cutting and crushing. The 2 burrs sit a set distance apart and shear every bean to the same size, which lets the water pull the flavor out evenly. A spinning blade just smashes the beans into dust and chunks, so the same pot comes out bitter and weak at once. A scoop of beans, a dozen turns of the crank, and the grounds fell into the drawer, smelling like the best part of waking up. The cheap blade grinder you own is loud, uneven, and quietly the reason your home coffee never tastes like the good cup you paid $5 for in town. If the mill got the grind right, the next tool got everything after the grind right. Number 8, the hourglass glass coffee carafe, sold under the name Chemex. A chemist designed it in 1941 as a single piece of laboratory glass shaped like an hourglass, with a thick paper filter folded into the top. And it has sat in a design museum collection for decades. The heavy filter holds back the oils and the fine silt that make coffee muddy and bitter. and the open cone lets you pour slowly and wet the grounds evenly, pulling out the bright, clean flavor and leaving the harsh part behind. You set the filter, poured hot water in slow circles, and watched clear amber coffee gather in the bottom. The pod machine on your counter makes a weak, faintly plastic cup in 15 seconds and buries a cup that cannot be recycled for every one you drink. The old glass made a better cup and left nothing behind. Those last tools made one good cup or one good crust. The next made a whole winter of food at once. Number 7. The cabbage and kraut cutter. It was a long wooden board with 1 or 2 angled blades set into it, a giant fixed slicer, and it came out every autumn when cabbage was cheap and plentiful. Sliding a cabbage head across the fixed blade shaved off ribbons of exactly even width, and even thickness is what lets a whole crock of cabbage ferment into sauerkraut at the same rate, so none of it rots while the rest is still raw. A few heads of cabbage, a handful of salt, and 20 minutes at the board filled a crock that fed a family for months. Today, that same self-reliance comes shrink-wrapped from a store. And most people have never tasted sauerkraut that someone they loved actually made. Here is something the appliance aisle would rather you never thought about. The kitchen we have been describing did not fade away on its own. It was replaced on purpose. In 1954, at an advertising conference in Minneapolis, an industrial designer named Brooks Stevens stood up and gave a name to an idea already reshaping American industry. He called it planned obsolescence, and he defined it, more or less, as the art of making a buyer want something newer and a little better, a little sooner than they truly needed it. 6 years later, in 1960, a writer named Vance Packard laid the whole strategy bare in a book called The Waste Makers, a tool built to last 50 years and be handed to your daughter as a terrible business because it only sells once. A flimsy version that fails in 3 years and cannot be repaired sells again and again forever. That was not a flaw in the throwaway gadget. It was the design. Your grandmother's tools were built before that logic won. The next 6 were built to outlive everyone who touched them. The first of those survivors does something your most expensive modern machine still cannot. Number 6. The Foley Food Mill. Made in Minneapolis from the 1930s on, it was a round pan with a perforated bottom and a hand crank that swept a curved blade, forcing soft cooked food through the holes. As the blade pushed applesauce or tomato or pumpkin through, the skins, the seeds, and the tough cores stayed trapped above. So you got a smooth puree without peeling a thing first, and without whipping in the air that turns a blended sauce pale and frothy. A pot of cooked apples, a few minutes of cranking, and out came applesauce, the deep color of the fruit itself. Run those same apples through your food processor, and you grind the bitter peels and seeds right back in, then beat in air until the sauce goes light and foamy. The old crank did the gentler, smarter job, which is why serious cooks still hunt the mills down at estate sales. If the food mill saved the sauce, the next tool rescued the plainest dish in the house. Number 5. The potato ricer. It looked like a giant garlic press, a hopper with a perforated bottom and a long handle, and you filled it with cooked potato and squeezed it through into fine threads. A potato cell is a little bag of starch, and when you smash or whip it, you tear those bags open, and the freed starch turns to glue, which is how mashed potatoes go gummy and gray. The ricer pushes the potato through gently in one pass, so the cells stay mostly whole, and the result is light, dry, and fluffy. Hot potatoes, one firm squeeze, a little butter, and you had a cloud on the plate. The handheld mixer so many people reach for is the worst possible choice because every extra second of whipping turns supper into wallpaper paste. Your grandmother never owned a mixer and never made gluey potatoes once. That ricer protected the side dish. The next protected something bigger, your trust in what you were eating. Number 4, the clamp-on meat grinder. A heavy cast iron grinder stamped Universal or Enterprise, bolted to the counter, and a crank drove a steel screw that pushed meat into a turning blade and out through a plate of holes. The screw squeezes the meat forward, the blade shears against the fixed plate, and you get a clean, even grind whose coarseness you set by changing the plate. But the real value was knowing. Your grandmother ground a chuck roast she had chosen herself, so she knew her hamburger was beef and nothing else, from one cut, not a blend scraped from 100. A pound of trimmed beef, a few turns of the crank, and dinner was honest. Today's pre-ground supermarket meat mixes the trimmings of dozens of cattle, which is the exact reason a single contaminated batch can trigger a recall across 40 states. That grinder gave you control over what went in. The next gave you back the thing you never have enough of: time. Number 3, the pressure cooker. The Presto Company of Eau Claire, Wisconsin, introduced the first saucepan-style model in 1939 at the World's Fair, with a twist-lock lid and a rubber gasket that sealed it tight. And after the war, it outsold every other pressure cooker brand in the country combined. Trapping the steam raises the pressure inside, and higher pressure lets the water climb past its normal boiling point, so the food cooks far hotter and far faster, while the sealed pot holds in the vitamins. An open boiling pot pours down the drain as steam. A tough beef stew that simmers 3 hours on the stove came out tender in 40 minutes. The lid hissed its steady song on the back burner while supper cooked itself. If any of this sounds familiar, it should, because the electric pot half of America bought in the last 10 years is the very same idea sold back to you as a brand new miracle. That cooker beat the clock. The next tool simply refused to die no matter what you did to it. Number 2, the old Pyrex glass. The Corning Company made its bowls and baking dishes from a special heat-proof glass called borosilicate that barely expands or shrinks when the temperature changes. Because the glass did not flinch at sudden heat or cold, your grandmother could pull a casserole straight from a hot oven, and the same dish could go from the refrigerator to the table, to the leftovers shelf, and back, year after year, without cracking. The set of nesting bowls in red, blue, green, and yellow was the wedding gift every post-war bride wanted. And a great many of those exact bowls are still in service today, 3/4 of a century on. They mixed, they baked, they stored, and they outlived the marriages they were given to celebrate. The clear bowls sold under the same name now are made of a cheaper glass that every so often shatters into 1,000 pieces when it meets a hot oven. The old glass almost never did. And that brings us to the one tool that holds the whole idea in a single object, the one your grandmother would have carried out first if the house caught fire. Number 1, the cast iron skillet. The Great American Pans, stamped Griswold of Erie, Pennsylvania, or Wagner of Sydney, Ohio, were poured and then machined, their cooking surfaces ground and polished nearly as smooth as glass. That smoothness is the secret nobody bothers with anymore. A polished iron surface, once seasoned with baked-on oil, becomes naturally non-stick, slicker than any chemical coating, and impossible to scratch off. And because those old pans were cast thinner than the heavy bricks sold today, they heated faster and more evenly, while still holding their warmth like a stone. You cooked an egg that slid free. You seared a steak that built a real crust. and you wiped the pan clean with a cloth, no soap, and no scrubbing. But the deepest thing about a cast iron skillet is not how it cooks. It is what it represents. A well-kept iron pan does not wear out in a human lifetime. It gets better with every meal, the seasoning deepening from gray to black to a glassy sheen, and it is meant to be handed to the next cook the way the woman in 1953 inherited hers from her own mother. That is the principle the whole countdown has been circling. Made to be handed down. Every gadget we have counted down shares it. Each was built once, built honestly, built to be repaired and used and loved until it belonged to someone not even born yet. Your grandmother did not own better gadgets because she was richer than you. She owned them because the world had not yet decided that the best customer is the one whose tools keep breaking. The skillet outlasted her. With a little care, the one in your hands could outlast you. So here is what I want you to do this week before all of this fades back into a pleasant story about the past. Pick one of these tools and actually go find it. Start with the 3 that change the most for the least effort. A cast iron skillet, almost certainly already in a relative's cabinet. A food mill for your sauces. A potato ricer for the one dish everybody at your table already loves. Any estate sale, any thrift shop, any grandparent's basement will have them for a few dollars, still working, still better than new. I will tell you what turned me into a believer. Last holiday, I borrowed my aunt's old potato ricer and pressed the potatoes through it instead of using my mixer. The mash came out so light and so smooth that 3 different people at the table asked what I had done differently and what the new recipe was. There was no new recipe. The only thing I changed was the tool, and I have never gone back to the mixer since. Now I want to hear from you and settle an argument down in the comments. Of everything we counted down, 2 tools always split a room: the cast iron skillet and the potato ricer. So tell me which one you are going to hunt down first, and which one you think your own grandmother swore by. I am betting the skillet wins, but I have been wrong before. Because in the end, your grandmother was not behind the times. She was holding on to tools that were made to be handed down, and the only mistake the rest of us ever made was letting go.